Lord in heaven, we thank you for this morning. We pray that you would be with us as we study your word, that we would see wonderful things in it that would bring encouragement and challenge and transformation to us. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. So this morning we are coming back to Psalms 9 and 10. Psalms 9 and 10. This is a portion that we began to study last Sunday night in the evening hour. And what I did last Sunday night was talk more about the poetry of these two psalms. And as I look out, I see a number of you weren't able to be there, so I'm going to repeat a little bit of that, but mostly we're going to be going through the visual outline. Now, I'll point out the way this handout works. Of course, there's a front and then a back. That's kind of like page 1 and page 2. That's exactly the same material that was on last Sunday night's handout. What's on the inside, the visual outline chart, is totally different. Okay, so I'm going to very quickly go through some of the high points in the stuff on the front and the back, and then we'll go through the chart itself. We're studying these two psalms together, not just because I've been doing two psalms together at a time, but historically, these two psalms are read together. In fact, in many ancient Bibles, they were read as a single psalm. So if you, for instance, say 200 years before Christ was born, 100 years before he was born, you picked up a Greek Bible, a Greek translation of the Old Testament, and you're reading through the Psalms, you get to Psalm 9, and Psalm 9 would be Psalm 9 and Psalm 10 combined together. And the result then, of course, is what we call Psalm 11, they would call Psalm 10. And what we call Psalm 23, they'd call Psalm 22. So it got a little confusing. And then you get further into the Psalms, and they do it again. They combine two more again, so now the numbering's off by 2. Later in the Psalms, they split one, and then they split another one. So by the time you're done, you still get 150 Psalms, but it's just a little bit confusing. It's not a matter of heresy, it's just a different way of understanding how certain poems work together. Yes, Frank?
Why would you suppose they were combined?
Well, that's what I'll talk about, yeah. So these two poems were combined. They have a lot in common with each other. One thing you'll notice that Psalm 9 has a long heading to it for the choir director on Muth Labben, a psalm of David. And then you have a long psalm, 20 verses. You come to Psalm 10 and there is no heading. There's nothing that says a psalm of David. And this is very, very unique in this part of the book of Psalms. From Psalm 30 to Psalm 32, this would be the only one that doesn't have a heading. And so some people have thought, well, they thought in ancient days, these two poems really go together. That Psalm, what we call Psalm 10, is really continuing Psalm 9. Also, look at the end of Psalm 9, verse 20. Verse 20 ends with Salah. This is some sort of a musical notation. If this is the end of a poem, it's the only place in all of the Psalms where this word ends a poem. Other times it ends parts of a poem, but never anywhere else does it actually finish out an entire psalm. So this was another indicator to people in ancient days that these two things go together. And really the big thing that unites them together is that Psalm 9 starts an acrostic and Psalm 10 finishes it. So Psalm 9, but it's an imperfect acrostic. It's broken. Not quite right. So Psalm 9, verse 1, the first word begins with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And verse 2 begins also with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Verse 3 begins with the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And you kind of expect that verse 4 is going to be the second letter again, but no, it's totally out of order. Then verse 5 is the third letter of the alphabet. And verse 6 is, and it kind of goes this way, but it's not totally predictable. It's clearly there, but sometimes a verse skips, sometimes it'll skip 2 verses. But by the time you get to the end of Psalm 9, you're halfway through the alphabet. And then you come to Psalm 10, and it picks up where it left off for the first verse. And then verses 2 through 11 have nothing to do with the alphabet at all. It's totally off. And then it picks up again in verse 12. And by the time you finish, you've made your way through most of the letters. You get to the last letter. There are 7 letters that are just skipped. There are some letters that are used more than once. There might be a few out of order. So that's kind of fascinating. In the ancient days, they saw that there was some kind of connection this way. Acrostics are often used to indicate an idea of orderliness. It also, of course, helps in memorizing things, if you can remember what the order of the letters are. In this case, it's both a kind of order as well as a sense of frustration. You never know when things are going to be out of order. And as you read through the Psalms themselves, you find that's one of the themes that's talked about here. God is our strength, He's our deliverer, He's the judge, He's going to make all wrongs right. But the troubles just keep coming and coming and coming, kind of unpredictably. So the message of the psalm is reflected in the poetry of the psalm. I should say the psalms, these two work together. This is one of about half a dozen psalms that use the alphabet like this as a kind of way of building itself. So we'd say this is a broken acrostic. Now these two parts of the poem are different in some ways. Psalm 9 deals with enemies that are national enemies. That is, they're foreign powers. It talks about the cities of the nations and the Lord judging the nations. When you come to Psalm 10, the enemy that David is facing seems to be a native Israelite. People who should know the Lord and fear the Lord, but they don't. So there are enemies both foreign and domestic that the psalm deals with. Psalm 9 is more triumphant. There's trouble, but there's confidence that the Lord is going to put down enemies. Psalm 10 is more mournful. It's as like new troubles have come, and we don't really see how it's going to turn out. We know it will, but the alphabet's not helping us anymore. The things are kind of unpredictable. In the end, though, the Lord brings triumph. Okay, so I'd like to read the two psalms in their entirety, and then we're going to start to go through the visual outline chart on the inside. But let's go back to Psalm 9. We'll read them again in their entirety. For the choir director on Muth Labben, a psalm of David. I will give thanks to the Lord with all my heart. I will tell of all your wonders. I will be glad and exult in you. I will sing praise to your name, O Most High. When my enemies turn back, they stumble and perish before you. For you have maintained my cause. You have sat on the throne judging righteously. You have rebuked the nations. You have destroyed the wicked. You have blotted out their name forever and ever. The enemy has come to an end in perpetual ruins, and you have uprooted the cities. The very memory of them has perished. But the Lord abides forever. He has established his throne for judgment, and he will judge the world in righteousness. He will execute judgment for the peoples with equity. The Lord also will be a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. And those who know your name will put their trust in you. For you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. Sing praises to the Lord who dwells in Zion. Declare among the peoples his deeds. For he who requires blood remembers them. He does not forget the cry of the afflicted. Be gracious to me, O Lord. See my affliction from those who hate me, you who lift me up from the gates of death, that I may tell of all your praises, that in the gates of the daughter of Zion I may rejoice in your salvation. The nations have sunk down in the pit which they have made. In the net which they hid, their own feet have been caught. The Lord has made himself known. He has executed judgment. In the work of his own hands, the wicked is snared. Higgaion, Selah. The wicked will return to Sheol, even all the nations who forget God. For the needy will not always be forgotten, nor the hope of the afflicted perish forever. Arise, O Lord, do not let man prevail. Let the nations be judged before you. Put them in fear, O Lord. Let the nations know that they are but men. Selah. Why do you stand afar off, O Lord? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? In pride, the wicked hotly pursue the afflicted. Let them be caught in the plots which they have devised. For the wicked boasts of his heart's desire, and the greedy man curses and spurns the Lord. The wicked, in the haughtiness of his countenance, does not seek him. All his thoughts are, there is no God. His ways prosper at all times. Your judgments are on high, out of his sight. As for all his adversaries, he snorts at them. He says to himself, I will not be moved. Throughout all generations I will not be in adversity. His mouth is full of curses and deceit and oppression. Under his tongue is mischief and wickedness. He sits in the lurking places of the villages. In the hiding places he kills the innocent. His eyes stealthily watch for the unfortunate. He lurks in a hiding place as a lion in his lair. He lurks to catch the afflicted. He catches the afflicted when he draws him into his net. He crouches, he bows down, and the unfortunate fall by his mighty ones. He says to himself, God's forgotten. He has hidden his face. He will never see it. Arise, O Lord God, lift up your hand. Do not forget the afflicted. Why has the wicked spurned God? He has said to himself, You will not require it. You have seen it. For you have beheld mischief and vexation, to take it into your hand. The unfortunate commits himself to you. You have been the helper of the orphan. Break the arm of the wicked and the evildoer. Seek out his wickedness until you find none. The Lord is king forever and ever. Nations have perished from his land. O Lord, you have heard the desire of the humble. You will strengthen their heart. You will incline your ear to vindicate the orphan and the oppressed, so that the man who is of the earth will no longer cause terror. Well, if you'll come with me now to your handout on the inside, we'll walk our way through the portions of this double poem. Up at the top of the handout is a purpose statement. It says, David composes these two psalms as a series, offering thanks to God for recent deliverance from foreign enemies, Psalm 9, and then pouring out his heart over domestic enemies, Psalm 10. The broken but persistent acrostic structure mirrors the unpredictability of events amid David's confidence in Yahweh. Over on the right side of the top, it tells you what kind of a poem this is. You know, there's about half a dozen, maybe 8, some would say 10, different kinds of psalms. Psalms of praise, psalms of thanks, psalms of instruction. This is a psalm of thanks, primarily. There's, if you count up the number of verses where thanks is being given to the Lord, there's more of that. But there are strong elements of lament. There are long sections of pouring out his heart to the Lord as well. David wrote this. It would have to have been sometime after the temple, the tabernacle was restored, around 1003. He talks about coming into the gates of Zion. And David wasn't in Zion until 7 years into his reign, when he moved the capital from Hebron over to Jerusalem. So it has to be sometime after that. Some have theorized that maybe this is after the events, his sin with Bathsheba and the birth of, and the prophecy that the sword would not depart from his house. It is interesting that the heading, one of the headings, on Muth Laben, the heading in verse chapter 9, Psalm 9, means on the death of the son. Now that might be his son. It might just be the name of a tune. We don't know. But the meaning seems to be upon the death of the son. And then again, there's a note there at the top. These two psalms create a broken acrostic, utilizing most of the letters of the alphabet, but unpredictably breaking out of order. And if you weren't able to be here last Sunday night, I think in the foyer there are still some handouts. You can see the handout I gave for the acrostic. Well, let's go down into the chart itself, and you see over on the left side that there's a heading. Actually, it's headings. There are 3 headings at the beginning of Psalm 9. There are musical notations, that it is for the choir director. That means it's been consigned over to the tabernacle choir director to arrange it or have it performed or have musicians learn it. And then I think the part that says on Muth Laben, on the death of the son, is probably a tune name, which, as you might imagine, would be kind of mournful. And then finally the last heading is the authorship. It is a Psalm of David. So we're going to study these 2 psalms in a way as if they're one, but you'll notice that they do break evenly from where we number Psalm 9, verses 1 to 20, and then Psalm 10, 1 to 18. There is a clear mark, a break between them. This is why Hebrew Bibles have always counted these as separate psalms. Separate psalms intended to be read together. The first half, Psalm 9, is a hymn of thanks with confident petition. So it's mostly thanks, but there's also asking God to do more, and David is very confident that the Lord will do it. It's all about Yahweh's deliverance from enemies. And this itself breaks into two main parts. Verses 1 through 12 is his prayer of thanks for Yahweh's overthrow of enemies. And verses 1 and 2 is his opening pledge of thanks. Psalms of thanksgiving often start off this way. I will do this. I will thank the Lord. I will bless the Lord. I will praise the Lord. Bless the Lord, O my soul. These are psalms of thanks. In this case, I will give thanks is a pledge that he's going to bring a thank offering to the tabernacle. And it's going to be a public show, a public demonstration about God's goodness. And so he repeats himself basically 4 times. I will give thanks to the Lord with all my heart. So it's not just ritual. It's really bubbling out of his heart. And as he brings this thank offering, the end of verse 1, I will tell of all your wonders. And the wonders here are the wonderful deliverances that he has brought, that the rest of the psalm will talk about. I will be glad and exult in you and sing praise to your name, O Most High. Again, this is a promise about what he's going to do at tabernacle. And of course, he might even sing these words as he's at tabernacle. So we tend to, when we read words like this, we tend to think about my personal devotion to the Lord and my prayer, and we can apply it that way. But what it meant for David was, I'm going to tabernacle, and I'm going to publicly acknowledge what the Lord has done. And I'm going to bring my thank offering, and because I'm the king, of course, everyone's going to be very keen on what I'm doing, and they're going to rejoice. They're going to rejoice with me. So then in verses 3 through 10 is a recitation of what Yahweh has done. These are the wonders of Yahweh, verses 3 through 10. He recounts how the Lord had delivered him and the nation from their enemies. Verses 3 through 5, we find that the enemies of the nation were defeated in answer to prayer. When my enemies turned back, they stumbled and perished before you, for you have maintained my cause. You have sat on the throne judging righteously. You have rebuked the nations. You have destroyed the wicked. You have blotted out their name forever and ever. So the thought is there had been enemy invasions, incursions of some kind. David had prayed to the Lord seeking his help. Israel was in the right. Their enemies were evil and malicious, and the Lord has put them down. And then David begins in verse 6 to meditate on the permanence of God's thrones. The kingdoms of men rise and fall. Their enemies rise and fall, but God's throne isn't that way. Verses 6 and 7 focus on the inevitable ruin of godless realms and the eternality of God's throne. Verse 6, the enemy has come to an end in perpetual ruins, and you have uprooted the cities. The very memory of them has perished. But the Lord abides forever. He has established his throne for judgment. And then the certainty of the judgment of the nations is brought up in verses 8 and 9. And he will judge the world in righteousness. He will execute judgment for the peoples with equity. The Lord also will be a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. This statement that he makes in verse 8, he will judge the world in righteousness, is a phrase that's repeated numerous times in the Psalms. And it seems to be, this is a phrase that the prophets will pick up on later on as well. This is kind of a prophecy. It's not only about what God does from time to time in Israel's history, but what he will certainly do at the end of the age, that there is a final reckoning where the throne of heaven will be evident to everyone, and the nations will come and bow before his throne.
That's what I was going to ask, is that was end-time related or eschatologically related?
I would say it is, although it's not exclusively eschatological. It's a general promise which is finally fulfilled at the end.
Yeah. Does it have any bearing sort of what Daniel said about the prophecy when And the days of these kings, so the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed.
Sure, yes. Yeah,
Parents with that?
Sure, yes. I think this finds its ultimate fulfillment in the millennial kingdom of Christ and the judgment which flows out of that. So this is all about, he's celebrating what the Lord has done, and yet he's also anticipating more of what the Lord will do. Then you come to verses 11 and 12, and this is still part of the portion on thanks, and he calls the congregation to join in praise with him. In verse 11, the sing praises is in the plural. Y'all, sing praises to the Lord who dwells in Zion. Declare among the peoples, that is, the other nations round about you, his deeds. So Zion's God, the God of Zion, is going to be great in all the earth. There's a hint here in verse 11 of the mission of Israel to the other nations. Now, they're not commissioned here to go be missionaries, but they are commissioned to be an example of those who know the Lord and trust in him. And that people ought to see in Israel the glory of God. A phrase like this would take on great new significance for a missionary who goes out for the sake of the name of Christ and declares more fully what the Lord has done through Jesus Christ. But in verse 12, part of the congregation's praise is about how Yahweh cares for the afflicted. For he who requires blood remembers them. Requires blood. Now this is not talking about that God demands blood sacrifice. It is true that blood sacrifice is demanded, but this phrase, to require blood, means that God holds accountable those who commit bloodshed. The violent enemies, like who had come against the nation, we can only imagine what happened. We don't know exactly when these events took place, but there are incursions, invasions. What happens when that small towns, villages get burned, people are murdered, people are taken captive, orphans are created, there's devastation, there's bloodshed. And the Lord sees.
This translation of the ESV says, he who avenges blood.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the NASB is very literal, require blood, but it's an idiom that means to avenge blood. Yeah. So the Lord sees the oppressed. He sees it when violence goes unchecked. And he may not answer in the exact moment we want him to, but he is the righteous judge. He will bring all the judgment. And this is a thing of praise. The Lord is not, no one is getting away with anything. And there's a beauty to divine justice in that way. So these first 12 verses are a psalm of thanks, or I should say a portion of thanks. But then we come to verses 13 to 20, and the tone changes. I don't know if the tune does or not, but the tone does a little bit. It's confidence in Yahweh's continued deliverance. Now you have in verses 13 to 16 a prayer for deliverance. There's a plea that he would be delivered from the gates of death in verse 13. Be gracious to me, O Lord. See my affliction from those who hate me. You who lift me up from the gates of death, that I may tell of all your praises, that in the gates of the daughter of Zion I may rejoice in your salvation. Do you notice the two gates here? You've got the gates of death, and then you've got the gates of Zion. Yes?
Silly question. In the gates of the daughter of Zion, that just means the gate of the temple for the children of Israel?
Yeah. Jerusalem is always envisioned as a woman. So the daughter of Zion is the inhabitants of the city. So sometimes Jerusalem is a mother, sometimes she's a daughter, but it's always a woman. So being in the gates of death, of course, means that you're about to be closed in, and that's the end. But instead, now he envisions going to tabernacle, to being with God's people and celebrating the life that the Lord had given him. So that's verse 14 is a pledge of public thanks. Lord, deliver me from this new trouble I'm in. When you deliver me, I will go to the tabernacle and give public acknowledgement along with the rest of God's people. In verses 15 and 16, he expresses his confidence in this new trouble in which he is. The nations have sunk down in the pit they've made. We don't know who it is, the Philistines, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Assyrians, the Syrians, the Egyptians. We don't know. Their enemies are many. But whatever was happening in this situation, David is confident that the Lord is going to bring victory, that these military plans that they've created are going to boomerang back on themselves. The net which they've hid, their own foot has been caught. The Lord has made himself known. He's executed judgment. In the work of his own hands, the wicked is snared. And then there's this little break at verse 16, and you have two Hebrew words, higayon and salah. The reason that you have two Hebrew words is no one agrees what they mean. Exactly. That's why they're not translated. But higayon might mean something like meditation. That one is probably a little bit more clear. Salah is still a guess. Some think it means something like musical pause. But it's clearly a break. It's clearly a break at this point in the poem. Verses 17 through 20 is another prayer for deliverance. It begins with a statement of confidence in verse 17. The wicked will return to Sheol, even all the nations who forget God. This reference to Sheol, it means death. The wicked are going to die. Now, this might imply what the New Testament calls the second death as well, in a hell. But at the very least, it's a certainty that God is going to defeat the enemies that they're facing. This is the fate of those who forget Yahweh, the nations who forget God. By the way, it's interesting that the title God is used there, not Yahweh. Yahweh is the name that he uses in covenant with his people. And many times when the other nations are brought in, they relate to him as God. So the nations who've forgotten God, well, that's Edomites, Moabites, Philistines, Egyptians, some of them who would have had some knowledge of God, but forgetting him means that they've rejected him and turned away from him. Verse 18, there's hope in God who doesn't forget. The needy will not always be forgotten, nor the hope of the afflicted perish forever. Again, the idea is these wicked nations have made incursions and invasions. They've brought death and bloodshed. The Lord knows and understands those who are suffering under that kind of thing, and the Lord will not let their affliction go on forever. So then the prayer itself is in verses 19 and 20. It's an imprecation. It's a prayer of judgment, a plea that God would judge the nations. He's already said confidently that the Lord is going to do it, and now he asks the Lord specifically, "Arise, O Yahweh, do not let man prevail. Let the nations be judged before you. Put them in fear, O Lord, let the nations know that they are but men." So he's praying for God to bring about the full extent of his kingdom and put down the false kingdoms of men. In a way, every time we as Christians pray the Lord's Prayer, "Your kingdom come," we are also implicitly praying that the kingdoms of men would be put down. Now it doesn't have the same contour. This is a prayer directly for judgment, but the result is that they would be in fear. And that the thought might also be that they would come to have a true fear of the Lord. And that's the way it is sometimes. Sometimes there are some people who fall directly under judgment and perish, and there are others who witness it and they come to fear the Lord instead. Well, then you have the Salah that ends verse 20, and that's the first half of this Psalm of Thanks. We come into what we call Psalm 10, and the poem takes a more mournful turn. You have another prayer for God's intervention. This poem, the whole thing, you can see on the right side of your handout, is a new lament, and yet there's continuing confidence. It's a prayer for Yahweh's deliverance from domestic enemies. There's a desperate plea for God's intervention in verses 1 through 11. The opening plea for deliverance, he cries to Yahweh for help. "Why do you stand afar off, O Lord? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" Now that language, of course, the Lord doesn't actually hide, but what he means is, I keep praying, I keep asking, and it seems like you're not there. It's the language of uncertainty. Verse 2 then spells out what the enemies are doing. The adversaries are described and they're imprecated. That is, judgment is prayed against them. In pride, the wicked hotly pursue the afflicted. Let them be caught in the plots which they have devised. Then that sounds similar to back in the Psalm 9 about the nations have fallen into the pit that they have dug. Their foot has been snared in the net that they had set. He's praying the same kind of language, but this time against different kind of enemies. And now in verses 3 through 11, he's going to recite what the adversaries have been doing. Psalm 9 recited what the Lord had done. And now Psalm 10 is going to recite what the adversaries have done. And it's interesting that in the poem, in the acrostic of the poem, this is the part that is the most disordered. All the way through verse 11. These enemies, and these are domestic enemies, that is, their fellow Israelites, they have this profane rejection of divine accountability. Cursing God and defying judgment in verses 3 and 4. The wicked, and it's in Hebrew is singular, the wicked man boasts of his heart's desire. The greedy man curses and spurns the Lord. The wickedness and the haughtiness of his countenance does not seek him. All his thoughts are, there is no God. This statement, there is no God, is often understood to mean what we call practical atheism, as opposed to philosophical atheism. Philosophical atheism is the notion that all gods are made up, they don't exist at all, and they just don't exist. Practical atheism would say, maybe there are gods, maybe there aren't, but they're certainly not involved in what I'm doing. They're not engaged at all. In the ancient world, almost nobody was a philosophical atheist. They just didn't exist. You were a polytheist, or if you were an Israelite, you believed in Yahweh. But so these statements, there is no God. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God, means there is no God who's involved or engaged in what I'm doing. There's no God who holds me accountable. I can live as if there is no God. It's a statement of practical atheism. And what he's saying, in essence, is, I'm not going to be held accountable for what I'm doing. No one's going to stop me.
Is that similar to the belief, like, I think it was Thomas Jefferson, that God, there was a God involved in creation and stuff, but then he just did the thing and stepped back and is not involved in our lives?
In a way, although that's more deism is what that is, that yes, there is a cosmic creator who got things started, but he's not involved. We're fully responsible to ourselves. I think this kind of practical atheism is more developed from the mythology that the gods they were up in this realm doing their own thing and fighting each other, and they weren't really involved with us down here. And of course, this is directed mostly at Yahweh. Yahweh is not going to do anything. I mean, if you go to the temple of Yahweh, there's nothing there, right? I mean, there's no image of Yahweh. It's unlike, so a lot of people thought, well, he doesn't exist. The Romans and the Greeks accused the Jews of being atheists because there was nothing in their temple. So.
Is this also related to what Elijah said to the prophet Buena? Where is your God? Is he fallen asleep? Doesn't he answer you? He's fallen asleep?
Well, I suppose so. Although in that case, there really is no Baal. There really wasn't a. But this is someone who's. No, not really. Because this is someone who's saying, I can do what I want. God is not going to do anything to me. As far as I'm concerned, there is no God. And then let me keep going. We're kind of short on time. Verses 5 and 6. There's a false confidence in temporal prosperity. Things go well in this guy's life. His ways prosper at all times. God's not stopping me. I'm getting wealthier and wealthier. And then David says to the Lord, your judgments are on high out of his sight. That is, you are the judge up on high, but he doesn't see it. Because he doesn't see you dispensing your judgment, he assumes that you're not involved or interested at all in what he's doing. As for all his adversaries, he snorts at them. He says, I'll not be moved. Throughout all generations, I will not be in adversity. No God is going to stop me. No other people are going to stop me. These are arch villains. And we can assume that a person like this is the leader of some band of marauders, of insurrectionists. Later on, he'll talk about the mighty ones that are used to oppress people. And verses 7 through 11 talks about his profane devotion to violence. He curses others. Not only does he curse God, he curses others with malignant deception. His mouth is full of curses and deceit and oppression. Under his tongue is mischief and wickedness. So this is the kind of guy who seems like he's making friends, but secretly he's planning to take advantage of people and bring them to nothing. We're told about his violence, how he preys on innocent people in verses 8 through 10, sits lurking in the places of the villages, in the hiding places, he kills the innocent. His eyes stealthily watch for the unfortunate, lurks in a hiding place as a lion in his lair. And then the rest of verses 9 and 10 use this lion imagery. He lurks to catch the afflicted. He catches the afflicted when he draws them into his net. He crouches, he bows down, and the unfortunate fall by his mighty ones. His mighty ones here would seem to be a reference to his cohorts, the other people in his band of criminals. And then notice in verse 11, again, is this false confidence in defying judgment. He says to himself, God has forgotten, he has hidden his face, he will never see it. So see, verse 11 indicates he actually does believe there is a God, but he's completely disengaged. So this is what helps us see that the atheism of the earlier verse is practical atheism. God doesn't hold people accountable. That's the gist of it. So this is all David's plea. Lord, you've got to help. These people are killing and marauding and destroying. They're cursing you and they're cursing others. So then the end of the psalm, verses 12 through 18, the last portion, is confidence in God's eventual deliverance. There's this confident prayer for deliverance in verses 12 through 15. The initial plea is in verse 12. Arise, O Yahweh, O God, lift up your hand. Do not forget the afflicted. And then in verse 13, he mentions how the wicked man has a false confidence, a false hope of impunity. Why has the wicked spurned God? He has said to himself, you, God, will not require it. And David's point is, what a foolish thing to think. How utterly foolish. God is witness to the abuse of the afflicted. Verse 14, you have seen it. And the you is God. God, you have seen all this affliction. You have beheld mischief and vexation to take it into your hand. That is, you're ready to take a hold of these evildoers and bring them to judgment. And so because of that, the unfortunate ones, the victims, commit himself to you. And then there's a final imprecation, a final prayer of judgment, verse 15. Break the arm of the wicked and the evildoer. Seek out his wickedness until you find none. Bring them fully to account for all that they're doing to your people, God. And then the poem ends in verses 16 through 18 with a very different tone. A statement of trust. So while there's been a lot of lament, it begins and ends with a statement of trust in Yahweh's deliverance. He gives an acclamation of Yahweh's kingship in verse 16. Yahweh is king forever and ever. Nations have perished from his land. So, if whole nations have been removed, like Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, you think about the people whom the Lord removed in the days of Joshua, and who were defeated in Psalm 9, his thought is, well, certainly he'll deal with the evildoers within our own land. He's king. And he mentions in verses 17 and 18 the certainty of Yahweh's attention and the vindication of the oppressed. Oh, Yahweh, you have heard the desire of the humble. You will strengthen their heart. You will incline your ear to vindicate the orphan and the oppressed, so that the man who is of the earth will no longer cause terror. What a striking description of this wicked kind of evildoer. He's a man of the earth, meaning he has no awareness of the God of heaven. He lives just for the here and now down below and will take advantage of people at every turn. But the Lord sees, and he won't allow that terror to go on forever.
Amen.